In October 2018, an engineer walked down into the garage under the swimming pool at Champlain Towers South, put a hammer to the ceiling, and wrote down what he heard. 2 years and 8 months later, at 22 minutes past 1 in the morning, that building came down on the people asleep inside it. 98 of them died. What the engineer wrote is a public document. So is the letter the board president sent her neighbors 3 years afterwards, telling them the damage was getting worse and speeding up. Everybody who could have acted had been told. Twice. In writing. And there is a third document published this June, 5 years late. It says that by the night the building fell, it had already been falling for 3 weeks. Surfside, Florida. This is a film about 5 documents. 2 of them were warnings. One was a set of minutes. One was a drawing nobody looked at for 40 years. And the last one arrived 5 years too late to be of use to anybody. Champlain Towers South was built in 1981 and stood 12 stories above the sand on Florida's Atlantic coast. 136 apartments, a lobby, a lift, a corridor of identical doors. From the beach, it looked like every other building on that stretch of coast because it was. Behind it, at ground level, there was a swimming pool. That pool sat on a slab of concrete. Under the slab, there was a garage. Everything that follows happens in the space between those 2 sentences. Above the slab, water, tiles, loungers, planters full of heavy tropical greenery. Below it, columns, painted bays, and the cars belonging to the people upstairs. The deck was a roof, and almost nobody who walked on it had reason to think of it that way. A deck like that is a flat plate. No beams. The floor is a single flat sheet of concrete, and the columns push straight up into its underside. Where a column arrives there is usually a thickened square of slab, a drop panel, because that patch of concrete has to take everything the column takes. There are hundreds of thousands of garages built exactly like it all over the world, and nearly all of them will stand for as long as anyone needs them to. What makes the type unforgiving is where its strength lives. Load in a flat plate does not spread out. It runs to the columns and crowds around them, so the strength of a whole floor is decided in the few square meters of concrete at each column head. Engineers give those patches a surplus. The connection is built to hold considerably more than anyone expects to put on it, because a building gets 50 years of things nobody predicted. That surplus has a name, the margin against failure, and it is the difference between a structure that survives its own surprises and one that does not. So the object at the center of this story is not a tower. It is a joint, repeated 30 or 40 times in the dark under a swimming pool. And a joint of that kind gives almost nothing away. It is at the top of a column in a car park, above head height, in poor light, behind a layer of concrete whose whole purpose is to cover what matters. For 37 years, those joints did their work, and nobody had cause to think about them. People bought apartments there for the reasons people buy apartments on that coast. You could hear the water from the balcony. The deck caught the sun before the street did. Cars went down the ramp and came back up several times a day for 4 decades. One more thing about that building, and it decides everything that happens in the second half of this story. The people in it were owners, not tenants. There was no landlord upstairs to write to when something went wrong, and no company that owned the structure and rented out the rooms. A condominium is a building owned in pieces by the people living in it, and the parts nobody lives in, the roof, the columns, the garage, the deck under the swimming pool, are owned by all of them together. Which means that when the concrete holding up that pool needed work, there was nobody to ask. There was only each other. And of everything held in common, the deck was the piece people actually used. A corridor is somewhere you pass through. A garage is where the car goes. The deck was the reason to live there. The pool, the loungers, the sun in the morning, the one part of that address a resident would show a visitor. It was also the roof of the garage, and the only surface in the building where the thing everybody enjoyed and the thing holding it up were the same slab of concrete. For 37 years, nobody had to look. Then the building turned 40, and Florida stopped leaving it alone. A building of that age on that coast has to be recertified. It is not a request, and it is not triggered by anything anyone notices. It is triggered by the calendar. Whatever was under that pool had been under it since 1981, unexamined and unmeasured. And now somebody was going to have to go down there with a light and put a number on it. In 2018, the association hired somebody to do exactly that. His name was Frank Morabito. His firm had been asked for a structural field survey, the kind of report a building of that age on that coast needs before it is recertified. What that word covers matters here, because it is the only reason anyone was down there. Recertification is not an inspection of the kind that happens when somebody complains. It is a scheduled reckoning, imposed from outside, in which a building has to demonstrate that it is still what it was certified to be. Somebody qualified goes over the structure and the electrical systems and writes down what they find, and the findings go to the municipality. Which means the report Morabito was writing was never going to be a private document. It was going to have two readers, the people who own the building and the town. The work is more physical than the phrase suggests. He walked the deck. He went down the ramp into the garage, and he did the thing that tells you most about concrete, which is to hit it. Sound concrete rings. Concrete that has come away from the steel inside it gives back a flat, dead knock, because there is a void behind the surface where the two used to be joined. A man with a hammer and a trained ear can map a defect through a wall that looks perfectly good, and he can do it faster than any instrument, and for the price of an afternoon. It is the oldest test there is, and on a coast, it is the one that matters, because the failure that kills a slab of this kind happens behind a surface that stays smooth right up until the end. Here is what that dead knock means, because the whole of what happened later is in it. Concrete is not solid the way a stone is. It is a hard sponge threaded with pores. Inside it, there is steel, and the steel is what actually holds a floor up. The concrete's job is to grip it and to keep water away from it. In a healthy slab, the chemistry of the cement keeps that steel passive, coated in a film a few molecules thick that stops it rusting at all. Salt destroys the film. On an ocean front, salt arrives in spray, lands on a deck, sits in whatever water does not drain, and works down through the pores until it reaches the bar. Then the steel begins to corrode, and corroding steel does something ordinary rust on a gate does not do. It swells. Rust takes up several times the volume of the metal it came from, and it does that inside a material with nowhere to give. The concrete splits outward from the bar. The split lets in more water. More steel corrodes. More concrete splits. The process feeds itself, it speeds up, and the surface gives nothing away until late. That is what Morabito was listening for. He found it in 3 places and he named them: the pool deck, the entrance drive, and the planters. Take them in order because each one is a different version of the same failure. The pool deck is the largest and the most important, and it is where the waterproofing had gone. A deck like that is built to shed rain within minutes. When it does not, when the falls are too shallow, or an outlet sits proud of the surface, or a seam has lifted a millimeter, the water does not leave. It stands. And the waterproof layer is the only thing between a puddle that sits there for 2 days and the steel underneath. The entrance drive is the same construction doing a harder job because cars drive over it. Every vehicle coming down that ramp is a load put on and taken off again, thousands of times a year, working at whatever cracks are already there. The planters are the quiet one. A planter is a box of wet soil. It is heavy when it is dry and heavier every time it rains. It sits in exactly the same place for decades, and the water in it has to go somewhere. Put one on a waterproof deck and you have made a permanent damp patch on a surface designed to stay dry, directly above the structure. Morabito wrote down all 3 in October 2018. He also found the reason. The waterproofing under the pool deck had failed, not was failing, had failed. So water had been reaching the structure below for a long time. In his report, he wrote that the failed waterproofing was causing major structural damage to the concrete structural slab below these areas. Major, in an engineer's writing, is not decoration. It is a category. Structural separates damage to the thing holding the building up from damage to everything else. He described the concrete itself as showing abundant concrete cracking and spalling. Spalling is what it sounds like. Concrete coming off in pieces, pushed away from behind by steel that has swollen. On the underside of a slab, it is the visible end of a process that has been running invisibly for years. Above reinforcement, no longer the size the drawings call for. Consider the position he was writing from. A structural field survey is addressed to the people who own the building, and they are the people who will have to pay for whatever it says. An engineer who overstates costs his clients money they did not need to spend. An engineer who understates leaves them standing under it. There is only one way out of that, which is to write down what is there and price it honestly, and let the people who own the building decide. Then he did what engineering reports do. He priced it $9.1 million. For a building of 136 apartments, that is an average of about $67,000 a household. Shares follow the size of the apartment, so some owners would have owed rather less and some a great deal more. The report went to the association, where it became one board's problem. And then somebody on that board did something about it. 2 days before the November 2018 meeting, a board member named Morabito took the report, along with a second one on the mechanical and electrical systems, and sent it out of the association to the town of Surfside. That is a small act, and it is the largest one in this story. Nothing obliged her to do it. A report commissioned by an association belongs to the association. Forwarding it to the municipality invites the municipality in. She sent it anyway, and she sent it before the meeting rather than after, which is the difference between telling somebody and asking them to come. It is the only moment in the whole record where a named individual, holding this information, moves it towards somebody with the power to act on it. It reached Ross Prieto, the town's chief building official, the office that decides what a building is allowed to be. It issues permits, it signs off inspections, and when it says nothing needs doing, nothing does. He came to the board meeting. There is only one room in this story, and this is it. A condominium board meeting on a weeknight. Folding chairs, a jug of water, 7 or 8 people on the board, and a scattering of residents who came. Somewhere on that table, 2 days old, is a report saying that the slab under their swimming pool has major structural damage, and that repairing it will cost $9.1 million. The town's building official is there. According to the minutes, he told them the building was in very good shape. That is what the record says he said. It is written in the association's own minutes, taken by the association's own secretary in the ordinary course of an evening's business. 6 words. In very good shape. They were said in a room where the report was already sitting on the table. Not a summary of the report, not a rumor of it. The document itself, 48 hours old, forwarded to his office by a member of that board. The engineer's finding and the official's reassurance were in the same room on the same evening, and only one of them was spoken aloud. Set that against what had happened 48 hours earlier. A member of that board had taken the report out of the association and carried it to the town before the meeting, so that the town would be in the room holding it. The town came, holding it, and said the building was in very good shape. Those are the 2 human acts in this story, and they cancel each other out. One person moved the information towards authority. Authority handed it back as reassurance. Nobody shouted, nobody was overruled, and nothing in the minutes records a disagreement, which is exactly why it worked. And a sentence like that does what sentences like that do. It forbade nothing. It ordered nothing. It started no clock. A board holding a report about major structural damage was told by the authority on buildings that theirs was fine, and after that, the repair stopped being an obligation and became a project, a very large bill that a few hundred neighbors would have to agree among themselves to pay on a timetable of their own choosing, with nobody waiting at the other end of it. The work did not begin. The report went into the association's files and the town's files and stayed there. A document that is filed is a document that is no longer moving. Nobody has to read it again. Nobody's required to act on it. It goes on being true in a drawer at the exact rate the concrete goes on getting worse. In June 2021, after the building came down, a reporter reached Prieto and asked about it. He said he did not remember receiving the report. On a lawyer's advice, he declined to say more. That is the entire record of that exchange. What he read, what he understood, what he meant, none of it is established. What is established is the sequence. The report was written. It was delivered to 2 institutions. It was read into a meeting as good news. And under the swimming pool, the concrete went on doing what concrete does. Then almost 3 years pass, and the reason is not engineering. There are two ways to find that money. Save it in advance in a reserve, which means charging everybody more every month for decades against a repair nobody can see yet. Or raise a special assessment when the bill lands, which means asking several hundred people at once for tens of thousands of dollars each. At the start of 2021, the reserve fund at Champlain Towers South held about $706,000. A study of what a building like that ought to have set aside put the figure at around $10.3 million. Put the two next to each other. $706,000. $10.3 million. 7%. That is what 40 years of monthly contributions had put in the account against the work the building was going to need, and the shortfall was not an accident or a theft. It was a series of ordinary, popular decisions, taken 1 year at a time by people who were charging themselves. So the second route is the ordinary one, and it moves at the speed of persuasion. And persuasion in a condominium is a strange currency. Every owner has a vote and a bill, and the two arrive together. Saying yes means writing a check for something invisible. Saying no costs nothing today, and the thing you are refusing to pay for makes no complaint. There is no meter running where anyone can see it. A board can put the engineer's report in front of every owner, and this one did, and it will still be a document about concrete addressed to people who are being asked for money. The report is the evidence and the invoice at the same time, and evidence that comes attached to a price is heard differently from evidence that does not. Estimates age while it moves. Construction costs climb, and corroding steel does not pause for a vote. Every month of discussion is another month of the same process running underneath the discussion. By early 2021, the work had been repriced. By early 2021, the figure had been settled at $15 million and apportioned by apartment. The range is what to hear. The owner of a one-bedroom would pay $80,190. The owner of the four-bedroom penthouse would pay $336,135. You could pay it in one sum or monthly across 15 years. 2.5 years had turned $9.1 million into 15. Some of that is simply what building work costs after 2.5 years. Some of it is scope. The longer a repair waits, the more of the structure it has to include, because the damage does not hold still while the money is discussed. A crack that needed sealing in 2018 needs cutting out and rebuilding later. That is the ordinary tax on delay, and it is the reason the number in a structural report is a perishable number. The estimate was not wrong. It had simply expired. That was the sum an owner had to find. Not for a new lobby or a better pool, for concrete under a deck, most of it in a garage, none of it visible from any apartment in the building. Delay was expensive in a way nobody could see, and cheap in a way everybody could feel. That is the most reliable way there is for a decision to be postponed. An owner in that building in 2019 was being asked to believe three things at once: that there was something seriously wrong with the structure, that it would cost them tens of thousands of dollars, and that the town's own chief building official had stood in their board meeting and said the place was in very good shape. Any two of those are manageable. All three at once is a very good reason to wait for more information. And then, after 3 years, they voted for it. In April 2021, the association approved the assessment, $15 million ahead of the building's 40-year recertification. 3 years of estimates and meetings and elections ended in a decision to raise the money and do the work. Every household in that building now knew exactly what its share came to and when it was due. To explain the decision, the board president, Gene Wadnicki, wrote to the residents on the 9th of April. It is the plainest document in this story, and it was written to be persuasive, because it had to be. That letter is the second warning, and the harder of the two to read because a consultant did not write it. A neighbor wrote it to neighbors about their own home while asking them for money. She told them what had happened since the engineer's visit. The observable damage, including in the garage, has gotten significantly worse since the initial inspection. She told them it was accelerating, and she told them where that led. The damage would begin to multiply exponentially in the years ahead. Read the sequence because it is short. October 2018, an engineer writes that the slab under the pool deck has major structural damage. April 2021, the president of the board writes to every resident that it has got significantly worse, that it is speeding up, and that it is going to multiply. Nobody in that building was uninformed, and the money had been voted. There was a date on it. Owners had until the 1st of July to pay the sum in full or commit to the 15-year plan. Then people went on living there. There was nothing to report from April, May, and the first 3 weeks of June, except ordinary life in a building where the paperwork had finally started to move. The damage had been surveyed. The work had a price. The money had been voted and the 1st of July was coming. This is the answer to the question people ask afterwards, which is why nobody left. Nobody left because there was nothing to leave. A building with a repair project is not an emergency. It is the most ordinary situation on that coast. Scaffolding goes up somewhere along that shoreline every week of the year. An owner who had read every word of the April letter would have concluded, correctly, that their building needed expensive work and that the board now had the money to do it. The damage was also in the 2 places in a residential building that nobody looks at, the garage and the underside of a deck. Nothing in an apartment on the 9th floor was different in June 2021 from how it had been in 2015. So the spring passed the way springs pass. Cars went down the ramp and parked under the slab that 2 people had now put in writing. Towels were left on loungers. After heavy rain, water stood in a shallow sheet across the deck the way it had for years, and then went, the way it always had. The repairs were being organized. That is the thing to hold on to about those weeks, because it is what makes them ordinary rather than ominous. A building that had argued with itself for 3 years had stopped arguing. There was a report, a price, a vote, and a date. The residents of Champlain Towers South had every reason to believe that the worst part of this was going to be the bill. The building came down on the 24th of June. The money was due on the 1st of July. 7 days. Nobody in that building ever paid the assessment. Nobody was waiting for anything to happen. They were waiting for work to start. And in the first week of June, in the garage, nobody had any reason to be standing in. 2 connections between the columns and the pool deck slab failed. There was nothing to hear. Nothing shifted that anyone would notice from the 9th floor. A connection that had been carrying its share of that deck stopped carrying it, and the load went into the concrete and the columns beside it, because load does not stop existing when a support does. It has to go somewhere, and it goes to whatever is nearest. Nobody was told because nobody knew. The people who could have been told were upstairs, waiting for the 1st of July. And here is the part that separates this from every warning that had been written down. The 2 documents in this story describe deterioration. Waterproofing that has failed, concrete cracking, steel corroding, damage getting worse. All of that is a condition. It is measured in years, it is repaired on a schedule, and it is what an assessment is for. What began in the first week of June was not a condition. It was a sequence. One connection handing its load to the next, then that one handing it on. Nobody in that building had been told to watch for a sequence, because nobody knew there was one. The repairs being arranged that month were the right repairs for the problem in the reports, and the problem in the reports had, that month, quietly become a different problem. For 5 years, nobody could say that with authority. There were theories, and some of them were good, and none of them was a finding. On the 22nd of June 2026, the National Institute of Standards and Technology published the technical findings of its investigation. The National Construction Safety Team, co-led by Judith Matrani Reiser and Glenn Bell. 5 years of collecting the physical evidence, modeling the structure, and testing what the drawings said against what had actually been poured. They did not reach that on paper. The team worked through about 24 ways the failure could have started. A sinkhole under the site, a failed pile, the ground floor slab tearing away from the basement wall. And to test the one rival that mattered, they built replicas of the garage columns and loaded them until they broke. Those columns failed brittle and all at once. That is not what this building did. So it was not the columns. 2 connections between garage columns and the pool deck failed in early June 2021, and the failure did not stop where it started. It spread, connection by connection, over about 3 weeks until the 24th of June. The mechanism has a name: punching shear, the characteristic failure of a flat plate and the exact risk that the thickened patch of concrete at every column head exists to prevent. The column stays where it is. The slab loaded from above comes down around it. All the load in that bay is trying to get into that one column, so the concrete immediately around the column head is in the most punishing condition anywhere in the floor. When it goes, it does not crack politely across the middle of the room. A cone of concrete shears out around the column, and the head passes through the slab, the way a pencil goes through paper. Then the load that connection was carrying transfers to the connections beside it, which were built to carry their own share and not somebody else's. If they have surplus, they hold, and the building stands there with an injury nobody can see. If they do not, the next one goes. That is why the number in the finding is 3 weeks and not 3 seconds. A structure that fails all at once gives nobody an interval. This deck failed in installments, and each one left the survivors carrying more. It ran like that for 3 weeks, under a swimming pool, above a garage with cars parked in it. What the finding gives is 2 dates and a process. 2 connections, first week of June, the whole thing down on the 24th. Between them, 3 weeks of a structure handing its load from one place to the next. There is no photograph of that, no witness, no alarm, no reading, no gauge. No moment in those 3 weeks that anybody recorded, because the only place it was happening was above the cars, in the dark, behind concrete. The building stood. That is all anybody can say about the middle of it. It stood on the 5th of June. It stood on the 12th. It stood on the 19th. It stood while the people inside it decided whether to pay $80,000 in one sum or across 15 years. Nothing in the record shows anybody knew it had started, which leaves the question that has been open since the first minute. Why was there no surplus left? The answer comes in 2 parts, and the second is worse. The first part is the deck. Its structural design was understrength. The steel reinforcement in it had been misplaced during construction, not where the drawings put it. Over the decades, it had been given more to carry than it began with. Heavy planters, added sand, pavers, and the steel inside it had been corroding the whole time, in a place where water stood. Now put 2 documents side by side. October 2018, an engineer writes that failed waterproofing is causing major structural damage to the slab below the pool deck, the entrance drive, and the planters. June 2026, a federal investigation finds that the collapse began at 2 connections under the pool deck, that the deck was under strength, that its reinforcement was in the wrong place, that heavy planters, added sand, and pavers had increased its load, and that its steel had been corroding for decades. One man with a hammer and a national laboratory with 5 years of modeling ended up pointing at the same tubs of soil. The second part of the answer is 1 sentence, and it is not about the pool deck at all. Judith Matrani Reiser, when building structures are designed and built to required codes and standards, they have margins against failure, meaning they should be able to support much more load than they are expected to bear. In the case of Champlain Towers South, however, these margins against failure were too narrow from the start. From the start. Not from 2018 when the survey was written. Not from 2021 when the assessment passed. From the beginning of the building's life, before anyone in this story had moved in, the distance between what that structure could carry and what it would be asked to carry was thinner than a building is supposed to have. Every argument in that association about money, every meeting, every vote, every owner who could not afford it, and every owner who could, was an argument about restoring something to a condition it had never been in. The 2018 report is not diminished by that. What it described was real, and it was getting worse, and it needed the money it said it needed. But it was a report about a building's deterioration, written on the assumption every such report makes, that there was a sound structure underneath the damage, and that repairing the damage would return it to that. The federal finding is that there was no such condition to return to. Glenn Bell, the other co-lead, said where the shortfall came from. The low margins against failure were primarily caused by 2 factors. First, severe and widespread deviations in the building's original structural design from the codes and standards of the day, but also some limitations in those codes and standards. And second, deviations in the building's construction from the design drawings. 2 gaps between the code and the design, between the design and the building that was actually poured. Reinforcement in the wrong position disappears the moment the concrete goes in. Entombed there, wrong for the life of the structure, and nothing anybody does afterwards will move it. The finding is that this building had both. Neither is visible to a resident. Neither can be found by walking a garage with a hammer, because a hammer tells you the state of the concrete, not whether the drawing it was built from was ever good enough. And neither is fixed by approving an assessment. On the 24th of June 2021, at 22 minutes past 1 in the morning, Champlain Towers South came down. It was a Thursday. Most of the people inside were asleep. The building was 40 years old. The failure inside it was 3 weeks old. There was no storm, no earthquake, no impact, no fire, no explosion. And it did not come down all at once. The pool deck went first. The tower stood for more than 4 minutes after that. Then the columns low in the east wing let go, and the rest of it followed them down. 4 minutes is long enough to put shoes on. Nobody did, because nothing in that building existed to tell anybody that the first part of it had already gone. By then, the 2 connections that failed in the first week of June had been handing their load on for 3 weeks, and every transfer had made the next one likelier than the one before it. The federal finding does not describe a building that was struck by anything, or shaken, or overloaded from outside. It describes a structure that ran out of places to put the weight. 98 of them died. This film will not describe that, or name them, or stage their last minutes, or show the search. Their families have been asked to look at those pictures for 5 years. What the record holds is this: the building had been examined, written about, priced, argued over, and warned about by an engineer and then by one of its own residents. The cost of repairing it had been counted twice. And when it went in the middle of the night without notice, out of a garage nobody was standing in. The record is clear about what those 3 weeks did not include. There was no evacuation order because nobody had grounds to give one. There was no inspection in progress. There was no warning to the residents that anything had changed, because as far as anyone knew, nothing had. The failure that had started in the first week of June was in the one part of the building that produces no symptoms upstairs, no cracked plaster, no jammed door, no sound. The people who went to bed that night were living in a building that had been diagnosed, priced, and scheduled for repair. That was the true position, and it was also by then 3 weeks out of date. On the 23rd of June 2022, the day before the first anniversary, Judge Michael Hansman of the Miami-Dade Circuit Court gave final approval to the settlement of the claims. More than 24 defendants, $1,021,199,000, $9.1 million to repair it in 2018, $15 million by 2021, $1,021 million afterwards. About $96 million of that was set aside for the people who lost one of the 136 apartments. Judge Hansman from the bench: it will never be enough to compensate them for the tragic loss they have suffered. This settlement is the best we can do. It's a remarkable result. It is extraordinary. In December 2021, a Miami-Dade grand jury reported on the collapse 6 months after it happened. It recommended inspections and reserve funds and the other things this case had made obvious to everybody who read about it. It did not reach a conclusion about what had caused this building to fall. Nobody could say it yet. The answer was 4.5 years away, in a federal laboratory, in a report that landed long after the settlement was paid, the site was cleared, and the story had stopped being news. In July of 2021, the Miami-Dade State Attorney convened a grand jury to look at how to prevent it happening again. It reported that December, under the title Surfside Condo Collapse, Recommendations to Make Buildings Safer. 98 people died, and what the grand jury returned was proposed changes to the Florida Condominium Act. It contains no indictment for the design, none for what was poured, none for the 3 years, or the 6 words in the minutes, or the 7% in the reserve. It is a document about next time. There is no defendant, because there is no single act, and the law on the whole punishes acts. Almost everything that mattered at Champlain Towers South was written down before it happened. The waterproofing had failed, October 2018. The damage was major and structural, October 2018. It was significantly worse and accelerating, April 2021. The price of stopping it, twice, and both times smaller than the price of not stopping it. One thing was not written down anywhere a resident could read it, and it was the thing that decided the outcome. The margins had been too narrow since 1981. That was in the drawings and in what was poured instead of the drawings, and nobody read either until a federal laboratory did it in the year 2026. So the arguments in that building were real arguments about a real problem, conducted honestly and aimed at the wrong 40 years. The residents were trying to repair a building that had been failing since it was finished. What they were assessing themselves $15 million to restore was a condition it had never been in. The building did not fall because nobody knew. It fell with the paperwork in order.